Thank you, Zoom lady.
The Zoom lady is louder than you, Patricia.
Oh, I'll try to speak up a little. Well,
speak up, everybody.
Let me call you to order. Public History Seminar 495595. It's my great pleasure to introduce you to Dr. Tom Hastings, my esteemed colleague in conflict resolution. I'm going to say a few words about Tom, and then you can go around and say a quick hello. And then we will circle back and I'll remind us of what we're doing, and I'll kind of do a time date stamp of our interview so that for posterity we know who we are and where and when. And then we'll get started. That sound okay, Tom?
Yep.
Okay, wonderful. So please let me introduce Tom Hastings, who comes to us as a faculty member in conflict resolution. He was born and raised in Minnesota, and he graduated from high school in the late 1960s. Did a number of things in the world. He was in a carpenters union. He has a foodie background that may come up today. And then went back to college and graduated with highest honors in 1993 from Northland College in Minnesota, and in Wisconsin, excuse me. And then got a master's in journalism. And I think a lot of his life story to 1996, if I will, is captured in a memoir. Yet to be published, but it does exist. And I'm very glad that it exists. I've already nudged him about this a couple of times, as you might imagine. And after getting his degree in journalism, he did teaching and also a lot of writing. He's published scores and scores and scores of news and opinion pieces that intersect with peace and activism in the nation and world. He has a number of other wonderful accomplishments inside and out of academia. You might know the phrase Oregon Peace Institute from your archival documents. Tom was very active in that group over the years here in Oregon. He's also, I think, a founding member of the Portland Peace Team. Is that right?
Yes. Which
is a wonderful activist organization that makes itself available in the activist community to practice peace in a very, very active way, at everything from protests to parades and more. So he comes to us to talk about his life in academia and on campus and in the activist world starting in the 2000s when he moved to Oregon. And I'm really excited to have you with us. I'll start my questions after we finish our introductions, and just welcome and thank you for being here.
Thank
you. Maybe we'll go around, start with Liza and just say a word or two. So hello.
Hi, I'm Liza Shade. I'm a grad student taking public history, and I work a lot with Patricia. I've taken probably every one of her classes, I think. And then my advisor is Katie Barber, so yeah.
Oh, okay. Great connections.
Yeah, for sure. Alex, you want to go next? Alex Ibarra?
Hey, I'm Alex Ibarra. I'm a graduate student in history. I do public history and Chicano history. I'm very excited to be here for this interview, listening to you talk.
Go ahead, Una.
Hey, I'm Una. I'm a post-baccalaureate taking graduate level classes. This is just my second term at PSU, so yeah, I'm interested to. I mean, I'm a native Portlander, so I'm around, but I haven't really had a lot of just my second term at PSU, so. Yeah.
Native Portlander?
Yeah.
Oh, you're the one.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Alex Berg.
Hey, I'm Alex. I'm an undergrad history major. This is my last term, so I'm excited to go out with such an interesting class.
Stephanie.
Hi, I'm Stephanie. I'm also a grad student in the public history program, and I'm also a Portland native.
Ooh, two in the same room, sort of.
Fantastic.
Me too, me too.
Oh, that's right.
Wow.
I forgot, Eliza. I forgot. Hey, Jake. Jake's only on audio today, Tom, so go right ahead.
Hi, I'm Jake Hutchins. I'm also a graduate student in public history, also native history. Professor Barber is also my advisor. Looking forward to the interview.
Well, as my grandfather always used to say when we talked on the phone, you're looking good.
And Lady J, you want to say hey?
Hey. Nice to see you again, Tom. Today I don't have my video, but I see you, and it's nice to hear your voice again so soon.
You're just up for all kinds of punishment, aren't you, Lady J?
Not punishment if you enjoy it.
We had our CR symposium on Wednesday, so Tom and Lady J are veterans of a very long day with CR, fabulous students and faculty presentations. So we're getting too good at this, you guys. We got to stop meeting like this. All right. So what's going to happen, Tom, is I'm going to go somewhat leisurely through the questions that you and I talked about, and probably be a couple of moments in the hour where I pause. As this is sort of I'll tip my hand, this is my dream team. Not only are these very advanced and polished students in history, but most of them, a significant number of them are PSU undergraduates and honors students. So there are people who I've worked with for a long time and I'm very well aware of their ability to learn in the moment and grow in an opportunity like this. So I'm going to actually, our task is for them to come up with some probes and follow-ups. So part of how we're doing this, almost like NPR or Fresh Air, kind of a live studio audience, is to give them a chance to test some of their chops as emerging oral historians, to ask a question or two as we go along. Does that sound okay?
Yep.
Perfect. Okay, so I'm going to start us. I'm Patricia Schechter. Today is Friday, May 8th, and we're in Portland, Oregon, at Portland State University, doing a virtual Zoom interview with Dr. Tom Hastings from the Conflict Resolution Program. And the interview is part of a history project that's getting underway this term in anticipation of the program's 25th anniversary. So thank you, Tom, for being here.
Thank you.
Great. Well, as I already said, our class was really fired up about appreciating the amount of protest in the early 2000s, the way that really the world was mobilized after 9/11, and primarily in opposition to the war in Iraq. And that's around the time when you came to Portland.
Yes.
I'd love you to tell your story about landing in Portland at such a moment of mobilization against war.
Yeah, I arrived late December of 2000, so then had the winter to prepare for my teaching, and started teaching at PSU just part-time, just as an adjunct in the spring of 2001. And of course, that was at the period of time when the country was undergoing sort of the aftermath of a hotly contested election, yet another election where the president was installed despite not winning the popular vote. This was George Bush the Younger, and a very, very fraught process that wound up being decided, in my opinion, amidst a lot of corruption in the state of Florida, and then by a 5-4 vote of the Supreme Court, which to me just, it called for a do-over, but of course they didn't do that. So it's kind of interesting, because when I started at PSU, I had no idea about what was going on, other than I had the good fortune to move to the state and to the city with the largest concentration of programs in my field in the United States of America, except for Boston, Massachusetts. And my field of conflict transformation or peace studies, it's a small field. In 1982, a friend of mine who was working for the Consortium of Peace Research, Education, and Development, which was our academic association, prepared a global list, a catalog of all peace and conflict studies programs worldwide. It was 2 pages, 2 sides. So we were a tiny little field in 1982. The latest directory is a very thick catalog of hundreds of programs around the world. So we are a growth field, and we're entering into sort of a range of being a discipline, a newer discipline, by which I believe, and you know, I'm not the authority on this, but I believe that is a function, at least somewhat, of how many doctoral programs you have. Increasingly, in our field, in the United States and around the world, you are looked upon with greater favor in a national and international search for professorial positions if you have a doctorate in our field. That's normal for hiring in the disciplines, right? But it was not normal when I started, because every single program was started by somebody who came out of a different discipline, but was drawn into this because of value affinity, usually. And there have been successive waves of growth in our field. The first was after World War II, when the great questions were basically 2. The greatest question was, how could people follow Hitler? How could they be convinced to do the god-awful things that they did? And so you had people doing research that fed into how we conceive of our field, like the Yale researcher Stanley Milgram, who famously tested people to see what their obedience to authority would be. I'm sure all of you are familiar with this. It's as historians, you have to be. And the basic, for if anybody didn't come across this, please do check it out. It is germinal in our field. And I use the word germinal advisedly. The word seminal is the one normally used, but that is gender exclusive. Germinal is gender inclusive, so I tend to sort of stick with that. Milgram studied the extent to which people could be convinced to obey authority, or putative or apparent authority, by constructing a test where they had to administer increasing doses of electric shock to people they could not see on the other side of the wall. And those dosages, they were ordered to do so by people in what the healthcare professionals call the long coats. Long white lab coats that indicate a higher status in the medical field and medical research field. They come in with clipboards, the long white coats, and issue these instructions as though they are an authority. They were all actors in this Yale study. None of them were actually healthcare professionals, to my knowledge. The people who were told that they were participating on the subjects of the research were actually the subjects of the research themselves. And it was found in contravention or contradiction to all the predictions that in excess of 90% of people who were convinced that they were being ordered to do so by authorities would administer increasing dosages of shock to the person supposedly on the other side of the wall. There was nobody on the other side of the wall. All they were doing was turning up a false shockometer or voltage meter and believing themselves to be administering these shocks as punishment for answering questions incorrectly. People were on the other side They appeared to be, or they sounded like they were complaining. They were saying, ow. They were screaming. They were whimpering, and then they were silent. And this kind of test this was part of the research that went into our field. World War II really raised great questions. How could people do the Holocaust, the European Holocaust? How could people drop atomic bombs on cities full of civilians? How could wave after wave of bombers drop bombs on civilian neighborhoods they knew to be full of just mostly women and children, because those countries, Germany and Japan, were at war. Able-bodied men were off in the military. These were not military targets. The pilots knew this. The bombardiers knew this. So these great questions came out of World War II. That also was the other line of sort of development or emergence that fed into the construction or the emergence of our field, was called ADR. That was much more quotidian, much more pedestrian. Alternative dispute resolution came out of the field of law. And that was the gradual emergence of the field of mediation out of the profession of the law or attorneys. So gradually in the 1950s, there was the first small wave of the beginnings of our field. Then in the mid to late 60s was the second wave because of the war in Vietnam. People were very interested in peace because this war in Vietnam made no sense to almost anybody. Made no sense to me, even at age 15 in 1965, 1966. My friends and I were all like, this is a stupid war. We're going to get drafted in this war in a couple of years. And so this whole country was kind of frothing up with like, what the hell are we thinking? So that was the second wave of emergence of peace studies and conflict transformation programs, degrees, awards, minors, certificates, etc. In our field. The third wave came during the Reagan years, came during the Euro missile crisis, when literally hundreds of thousands of Europeans were blossoming in protest and resistance into the street. Members of the German Bundestag were climbing fences at the United States air bases in Ramstein and other air bases in Germany. 12 German judges in full judicial regalia went on to the Mutenlangen United States Air Force Base and sat down in blockade in protest of these nuclear weapons that the United States, under Reagan's orders, had placed all around Europe. And the German judges said, our ancestors made horrific mistakes 50 years ago. We are not going to make those same mistakes. This was another sort of fluorescence of resistance during Reagan's Euro missile crisis, and ultimately that resistance in Europe and even in the United States paid off. In December of 1987, Reagan and Gorbachev sat down and signed the very, very first disarmament treaty, nuclear disarmament treaty, where entire classes of nuclear weapons and their delivery systems were outlawed and banned, and those were ordered dismantled. All other nuclear treaties prior to that had been merely what one person in DC in the peace lobby called production schedules. In other words, we're going to cap our ceilings at this. Can we agree to this cap of ceilings? These thousands of nuclear weapons that represent 40 times overkill. We can kill everybody on Earth 40 times. So you understand why the field of peace studies began its third wave then of emergence. So that's during the period of time when I was finishing up my stint as a single dad with my sons, living under my roof. And then I finally could go to college. I still don't understand. I still have students who are like single moms, single dads, and it's like, I don't get how you do it. I could never do it. I put in 12 years as a single dad, and I deferred my college education until literally a month after my youngest son graduated from high school. So during that period of time, then I happily I had transitioned out of just working first in the Carpenters Union and then as a self-employed subcontractor, trying to support my boys and me, and had transitioned into being a full-time community organizer. Two women and I started an organization called Waging Peace in northern Wisconsin. We worked a lot on peace issues, nuclear issues, treaty rights issues with Anishinaabe activists, and sustainability issues. And during that period of time, as I was coming up on finishing my, like day-to-day single dad occupation, I went to a conference hosted by a historian, Dr. Kent Schiffer. And I had never heard anyone make erudite information so accessible. I was fairly skilled as a community organizer. I had a lot of hard skills and competencies that I had picked up, but I had no serious structural analysis. This is what Dr. Schiffer gave to me. I mean, I literally heard him talk a couple of times, sold my house, moved to his town, and studied under him for a little bit over 4 years. And because I was motivated and a non-traditional student, I literally graduated not even tied with anybody, summa cum laude, the only one in my class, and was, because unlike most college students, I not only knew what I wanted to do because I was non-traditional, and I had formed, what's that? And
for a second, I couldn't hear you.
Oh, okay. But also, frankly, that was the month that I started my very first class coincided with the month that I stopped drinking alcohol. As a construction worker, of course, I had beers all the time and so forth. But that's, I was just starting college and stopped drinking alcohol, which is when most college students start drinking alcohol. So I had a distinct couple of advantages, so graduated ultimately with a degree in peace and conflict studies, but because it was founded, that was the first peace and conflict studies program founded in the state of Wisconsin. Wow. Founded in the 1980s in that third wave by Dr. Schiffer. Right. And so to me, it was like very fortunate, or at least I regard it as fortunate, because since it was founded by a historian, almost all the core classes were history heavy. So I effectively have like a peace and conflict studies undergraduate degree, but with a heavy concentration in history. And my students normally tell me that that's the piece of what I provide in my classes that is what they have missed in their secondary education.
Wow, that's really powerful. I think in my own path through higher ed, the book we got out of the World War II moment, the sort of psychology moment after the Holocaust, was The Mass Psychology of Fascism by Wilhelm Reich, which has a kind of more literary approach, but a similar set of concerns around how does this happen? How do people move to this place where the unthinkable happens? So it's such an incredible personal and intellectual journey you're on. So how does Oregon catch your attention? You're in school and you realize that there's just more peace nerds out here, and somehow the word is out. And so how do we get from this incredible flowering in the Middle West to the far West?
Yeah, well, it's not as intellectual as as all that. Basically, I was on the National Committee of the War Resisters League in my, I don't know, second term or so on that, and fell in love with a woman who was also on that national committee, who lives in Portland. And so even though I had just found my dream job, I actually recruited my own replacement and moved to Portland to be with her. That did not work out, but I have been told that she was my gateway drug to Portland. But before I came here, like I said, I went through this catalog to which I referred earlier, and Portland had 6 programs, whether they were certificates, minors, awards, or degrees. Mm-hmm. So I basically sent a copy of the first book I wrote and a letter of inquiry to the chairs of all of those programs. And I guess this was maybe back in the wild and woolly days, because I was an adjunct at most of them. And actually the only place I did not wind up being an adjunct at in the greater Portland area with a program in our field was George Fox University, because they made you sign some papers that included that you have accepted Jesus Christ as your risen Savior. And I said, well, I'm just a pantheistic tree hugger. I can't do that. And he said, okay, well, I'm sorry, but we can't hire you then. I said, well, what do you do about trying to teach about other religions or other cultures? How do you expect your students to really learn? Well, that's just the way it is. So that was my one opportunity and I've been told since by very cynical people, oh, you should have lied. No, thank you. If the places I wound up teaching, including Pacific University in Forest Grove, and Merrillhurst, bless their long, recently departed hearts.
Yeah, right.
But then I also spent 10 years just teaching one course, sometimes 2 at PCC Sylvania. But as it happens, PSU basically offered me more and more responsibilities. When I started at PSU, the conflict resolution program, since you're doing a history of the program, I'm sure you'll get this, but when I started in 2001, Rob Gould was the founder and the chair, or the director, whatever his official title was, and he would have annual retreats. And I will never forget the first one I went to at McMiniman's, and there was Rob, and basically 1 half-time faculty and 14 adjuncts. It was the Wild West. And I remember being part of a mediation community, which was sort of started by a man named Sid Lezak.
Oh, yeah. I know Sid.
Yeah.
I know Sid Amuro. I mean, may he rest, but yeah.
Yeah.
They were great friends to Nick and me.
Yes, wonderful man who is credited with bringing the field of mediation to Oregon, basically. And so he had this thing where there were monthly luncheons, and it was in the McMinimans on Broadway. So I started to go to a few of these when I first came to town, and wanted to get to know the mediators in town. And he had this. It was a breakout back room, so that the doors were shut, and it was just basically a free for all with mediators. And I remember sitting at one end of the table and looking around at every single person at the end of the table, and they were all graduates of the PSU Conflict Resolution graduate program. and they were all mediators professionally in town.
Wow.
And most of them had been hired to at least teach one course in our graduate program by Rob. And so it just kind of bonked into my head at that moment. And I said, this is like the Rob Gould version of Andy Warhol, where everybody gets to teach at PSU for 15 minutes. It was unbelievable to me that, I mean, these were talented people, and Rob had an eye for rounding up talented people, and basically his process, the way that he formed his actual full-time faculty was one that he was partially forced into it, and he partially invented by himself. And very, very nimble, very flexible, very adaptive, but his process boiled down to this: hire a raft of people and then look at their evaluations, watch them teach, and slowly winnow them out. And so the way that I began to think about it is going to these faculty meetings, and this is back in the day when Rob would have faculty meetings where every adjunct was welcome, because who else was going to go? And it was interesting. And I survived what I began to call the lunch of the long knives, time after time, where either Rob and or PSU would say, budget cuts, we have had to reduce faculty by 3. And it's like, okay, I'm still here. Yeah. And this went on and on. And finally, somewhat stabilized. So you had people like Amanda Byron and me sort of ascend from adjuncts to full-time. Barb Tint was already hired with an idea of becoming full-time. Rachel Cunliffe was hired after competing in a national search. It was the first national search. I was on that committee. In fact, I was the only faculty member who attended every one of the demonstration teaching events that went along with that hire. There were several outstanding candidates, but Rachel impressed me, and I sort of became her champion to try to get her hired because I regard her as an outstanding faculty member, and still do.
Amazing. I love the part about watching each other teach and winnowing the most sort of powerful or successful teachers. Can you say a little bit more about responsiveness to students, about the appetite or interest of students in peace studies, or some of the other skills that were in the toolbox of the program faculty at PSU? Like where were I love the LEZAC lunch. I mean, that's fantastic. But can you bring us to campus and bring us more into what the students were asking for, how you met their needs?
Yeah, I'm not positive that there was a direct 1-1 correlation between eliciting from students, which is supposed to be the heart of conflict resolution. We're supposed to be all about listening and eliciting. I mean, we have like favored figures. I mean, I think of like John Paul Lederich at the Kroc Institute in Indiana, South Bend, Indiana, at Notre Dame. And he's just kind of known as the sort of czar of elicitation. I mean, he's developed so many intellectual tools that tell us in our field why we should be so good at this. And yet, I'm not convinced that this is necessarily how our program 100% evolved the way that it should. I think it was a little bit more haphazard than that. But at some point, inevitably, you had to start looking at student credit hours, enrollment numbers, and say, that's got to be your number one feedback tool. The written evaluations from students, oftentimes, even though students are told, yes, this is given, you know, that nobody will see, this is anonymized, and you know, nobody looks at this until after your grades are in, etc. Students are rightfully, naturally, a little paranoid about that. And so, with exceptions, oftentimes, especially in standard evaluation forms, we'll just praise professors. And to take that seriously, I think, is an emotional error and a data error. I mean, it's like, yeah, it's not actually true that we can walk on water. That is, it's just not a great way to take information in. But I think student credit hours at least can provide a rough translation. So gradually, as these, what I, you know, said, the lunch of the long knives proceeded, part of that was a reflection of who was drawing students to them. And so for me, it became increasingly clear that for a couple of good reasons, I needed to focus on undergraduate students. Even though all we had was a graduate degree, all we had was a master's degree. Still, to me, that's who was interested in my courses. The reason for that, I believe, is that I'm driven by values, by, I guess, peace ideology, and less by well-paying career competencies. I teach hard skills, but frankly, they are not necessarily the skills of middle to upper management, etc. There are more the skills of advocacy, social movements, how to organize something and get public policy, corporate policy, or institutional policy changed. The professionals that I teach are generally lower paid because there's simply less money for such advocacy work. So I differ from most of my colleagues in that. Not that our values or our affinities are different, but our orientation in teaching is different. And the graduate program is designed and hopefully will continue to turn out professionals who can enter at mid-level and proceed upward from there.
Yeah.
You know,
I love how you've been so nuanced in your appreciation for power dynamics in the educational setting, whether it's student evaluations, whether it's what are we really preparing, who are we preparing whom to do what jobs. I think that's so powerful. But I'm gonna have one more question about sort of tone of campus, and then I'm gonna open it up for some probes from our students. But you could, again, because you're so keenly aware of where you are and who you're talking to and who you're not talking to. So on the one hand, we have this Portland and an Oregon with lots of peace resources and peace sensibility. And then you have PSU that was created for veterans. And in fact, one of the things we've been tussling on all term is that peace language and war language often are kind of born together. They're almost joined at the hip. I'm being a little cheeky here for a moment. So, and we've been puzzling over that and thinking about how war and peace are memorialized and how they go together and when they don't go together. Do you have an example or a sense of the campus as even waging peace sort of imbibes a little bit of that martial flair, if you will, in the acts of cultivating nonviolence, right? So I think it's all very interesting. So can you bring us back to a moment or an example of the split between the Oregon of the Mark Hatfield, right, and the Oregon and the PSU of the veteran, and war-tested soldier, if you will?
Well, it's interesting to me as somebody who I was initially trained in as an activist by veterans of the 1930s, because I was born in 1950. So my teachers were from the labor unions and organizers, the initial socialists who started organizing. It was all very, very adversarial based. So that, yeah, I mean, it was like, okay, we're an inch away from grabbing lead pipes and manning the barricades. And so that was my initial training. And then, and I come from a family of I was taught as a boy, you need to be defiant of authority sometimes. So, so with this training, all based on adversarial stances, and bringing that training with me into peace, justice, and sustainability work, I soon found other strands of training that were very, very different from mine. Mm-hmm. So people coming out of the historic peace churches, a bunch of Quakers, suddenly I'm in the peace movement with organizers who are nice people. And they are trying to call people in rather than call them out. They're very different, and they hit me like a ton of bricks. And I realized I have to start unlearning stuff while at the same time sort of concomitantly trying to learn new things. And that to me is the hallmark of this field of conflict resolution. And it shows up in bold relief in Portland, in the history, and even currently. So I see both these strands, and and I struggle to balance them in my own life. Yeah. Okay, so I wasn't around Portland in the 60s, but I love the recent history, focusing on the year 1970 in the Portland magazine, the PSU magazine. But the founder of our program, Rob Gould, I hope you interview him. Yeah, he'll be able to really shed light on this, because he spent 8 years working for the American Friends Service Committee as a draft counselor right on this campus during that period of time. He's a Portland native. His elementary school, which everybody knows who has ever talked to him because he never tires of telling the story, is now Shattuck Hall. And so his grounding in Portland is pretty complete. And those very, very hot and heavy years were part of it. So he was in Portland when there were, all kinds of bombings and everything else, barricades and a very polarized environment. And I can tell you, as somebody who got a conscientious objection status officially as an 18-year-old during the war in Vietnam, those were very polarized times in my community as well and across the country. It was very hard to mend the fences between the returning veterans and the resistors. Some of us did so, pretty quickly. And I felt like the peace movement in general tried to do so pretty quickly, to the point where, I don't know, sometime watch the old movie Born on the 4th of July starring Tom Cruise, in a historically accurate role, playing a guy who came back, a victim of friendly fire in Vietnam, came back as a quadriplegic in a chair, and Ron Kovics, and wound up being one of the leaders of the peace movement. And so during that period of time, oftentimes you could see peace marches with veterans for peace at the front, leading the peace march. That is exactly what we did in Portland in opposition to the invasion, the planned invasion of Iraq. So in the fall of 2002, when George Bush and Dick Cheney announced their plans to invade Iraq based on what we well knew to be a pack of lies, two great big lies, in particular that Saddam had WMD, which we all knew he did not, and that Saddam was about to give his WMD to bin Laden, when in fact bin Laden had a death fatwa on Saddam Hussein, and Saddam Hussein had outlawed al-Qaeda in Iraq. So those of us in the peace community absolutely knew, and frankly, most Europeans knew this. Most people around the world, the bulk of the people who did not know anything about this were regular people who listened to mainstream media in the United States. So we began to organize seriously, and veterans were almost always at the very front of our peace marches with big banners proclaiming themselves Veterans for Peace. So that sort of polarization was reduced quite a bit because of that, because of the peace movement welcoming veterans in who had a peace conversion. And by the way, there have been sort of two large waves of veterans to come into American institutions of higher education. One wave was following the end of the Vietnam War. Lots and lots of combat veterans took advantage of the GI Bill, and there was a big wave. My father was a professor then. He had lots and lots of veterans in his classrooms and in his program. The same thing has happened now, of course. I have lots of veterans in my classes. It's very interesting. Sometimes they come in and start fighting me, and by the end of the term, most of the time we're on the same page. And a lot of them have started out with basically some version of, I was in the military. I went through a lot of experiences in the military. I came out the other end of the military thinking that there had to be a better way to resolve conflict. So I decided to take one of your classes. This, I think, has led to a pretty high percentage of the conflict resolution students being veterans. And their opinions are highly respected, highly regarded by everybody in our classes. But the polarization in society, I haven't witnessed anything. I don't think even Vietnam was as polarized as what we see now thanks to Donald Trump. And I say thanks to him because I think nobody who's exhibiting this rise in hate crime, rise in hate language, I don't think he created anybody new doing this, I don't think. I think what he did was just basically gave everybody who was already sort of in possession of those proclivities permission to do this stuff. And so we see this well underway. We are well down the road of polarization that, to me, the worst possible outcome in the end would be if Donald Trump loses a relatively close election and claims victory, and then we have an armed rebellion in his favor to basically do a coup on the United States democracy.
I don't even want to hear it out loud, especially after such a beautiful discussion of what happens in your classrooms.
Yeah, I mean, to me, it's a jump ball. Everything's a jump ball right now.
It would be hard, just even more, if I don't know how much more heartbreak I can take. I'll just put it in very personal terms. Yeah. So we have thank you, just a few minutes, but I want to open it up to students who have been wrapped. You've sort of touched on many of our theses and our historical conundrums, and I want to open the floor to someone who would like to probe a little more deeply or ask a question. Just give me a little wave, and so Liza, go right ahead. And then Alex.
Not wrapped, at least tolerant. Yes.
I don't have a question, but I just wanted to say I thought it was so interesting how you sort of laid out these different waves as, post World War II, and also including that World War II conversation is something we have not been thinking about. We've been kind of starting with anti-Vietnam stuff and moving forward from there. So it was interesting to get that sort of like earlier of a background on it. And then again, that the perspective of the waves really kind of helps me picture it because I'm such a visual person. And so thinking about an exhibit makes me wonder what we can do kind of with that timeline. So
Interesting.
That's great.
My mentor, Dr. Kent Shifford, a historian, taught me to think in terms of historical periodicity. So that has kind of flavored my thinking about this, which I haven't actually heard anybody else sort of talk in these waves, even in my field. This is just my own observation.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Alex Berg, go right ahead.
Well, this is kind of like a mini question. At the very beginning, I heard you say conflict transformation instead of conflict resolution. And I was just wondering, do you see, like, was that on purpose, or do you see those two terms as kind of interchangeable, or?
They're interchangeable to the state legislature, but who is actually, you know, they've had this conflict resolution designation, which is one of the reasons why we had to use that term. But I will refer again to John Paul Lederach, who argued maybe 25 years ago that we need to change the name of our field to conflict transformation. And his logic, which I subscribe to, is that conflict is inevitable, conflict's wonderful, conflict is basically the source of most of our creative impulses and products. Without conflict, there would be very few artists. Without conflict, you would have very few really interesting works of fiction and many other, you know, without conflict, you don't have really hard driving problem solving, I think. And I believe that he was correct in that analysis, but he said, what we have to do is understand it in terms of the conflict. That conflict exists is never going to be in question. It's only a matter of how we manage it. So the idea is to identify where we find destructive conflict that results in hurt people, even all the way to dead people, wars, and well, okay, not to pick on lawyers, but it's the old joke of, you know, who's the poorest man in town is the only lawyer. And then who are the two richest people in town? The two lawyers after the second one moved in so they could fight about it. And this adversarial system in the law resulted in some lawyers who don't like that aspect of it being drawn to starting this field I talked about, alternative dispute resolution. They wanted to make the law transform destructive conflict into constructive conflict so that you have the possibility of a win-win rather than a lose little, lose big outcome. I mean, it's like what I tell students, or at least what I used to when I used to teach intro to conflict resolution, is at one point, all the insurance payouts had been made after 9/11 to the World Trade Center. And 2/3 of those payments had been spent. Nothing had been reconstructed. All of those first 2/3 had gone to lawyers fighting about everything. So this is a dysfunctional system when we look at an adversarial based system, whether it's in the law or whether it's in the militarism that results in war. So the idea is to say, how can we bring about and design processes of conflict management that transform them into creative, collaborative, problem-solving exercises that put everybody on the same team. So Alex and I are in conflict, and Una is our mediator, and she does enough assessment to find Alex and my shared values or shared interests, and she builds off of that to do brainstorming that ultimately results in a mediated outcome where we both gain instead of we both lose.
So eloquently put. I'm afraid I have to call us to a close, but I want to thank you, Tom, and thank everyone here today. Such a beautiful, eloquent, and illuminating discussion of this rich history, which we are now all a part of. That's one of the great unintended consequences of history that we're now all linked. So thank you. I'm going to let our students go. I'm going to push stop on the record button, but Tom, you'll hear from me shortly with the transcript and maybe some more follow-ups to come. So just thank you, everyone. Have a great weekend. Take good care of yourselves. Rest up. Stay healthy. Many thanks. See ya.
Patricia,
Bye.
can you send me something as well?
Yeah. What you got, Cece?
No, can you send me something as well?
Of course. Absolutely.
Because
Absolutely.
I'm sorry, I just got your email.
Oh, okay. It's all good. Tom, thank you. Take good care.
You
Hey,
too.
Tom.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, everybody. Much love. Much love. I'm going to go. I got it at 2 o'clock, so I got to fly. Thanks, Lady J.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you. Bye, Cece.